Mary Street, Gympie is one of Australia's most unusual main streets. It's existed for 150 years. Generations of Gympie children have grown up with its details in their consciousness. So, I'm going to begin by telling you my earliest memory of Mary Street, and after my talk, I'm going to ask you to share your memories. When I was 16, I accompanied my father on a road trip from Maryborough to Brisbane. In those days, though it's hard to believe, the Bruce Highway passed through Mary Street. Dad parked outside a cafe in Lower Mary Street and said, "I'm going to give you a treat you'll never forget." We watched as the elderly Greek gentleman behind the counter carefully made us malted milks. They were unforgettable, cold and sweet, with nutmeg sprinkled on top. In Dad's opinion, there were no better malted milks in Queensland, and he was a travelling salesman at the time. Anyone know the name of that cafe? London. Yes. Commissioners Hill. Because of its location and the circumstances of its creation, Mary Street has always been a difficult thoroughfare. It begins at the Five Ways and follows a narrow creek bank, which extends along Lower and Central Mary Street and is prone to flooding. Then it rises up Commissioners Hill. These are all locations where no sane town planner would ever create the central business district of an important town. But Mary Street was created by the insanity of a gold rush. In 1867, when James Nash found alluvial gold in the deep gully that is now buried under the Five Ways, diggers rushed there to peg out claims and pitch their tents. And the original gully still comes down Nash Gully, goes into a big tunnel under here, under the Five Ways, round the corner, out through Memorial Park, and finishes up at the river. So it's still there, but you don't notice it. Storekeepers and publicans quickly followed, building their humpies among the trees along the narrow track that led to the scene of excitement. When government officials, such as the Gold Commissioner, the Police Magistrate and the Postmaster arrived, they built their offices on Commissioners Hill, a good place to look down on the hustle and bustle created by lesser mortals. The gold rush created a long thoroughfare through virgin bush. It stretched from Old Maryborough Road through into what became Duke Street, along Mary Street, up Caledonian Hill, through Apollonian Vale, up and over Red Hill to the 1 Mile, then across Deep Creek to the Monkland. From this route, eager diggers spread out through the bush to search for alluvial gold and the quartz reefs from which the gold had eroded. Only a month after the gold discovery was announced, the Maryborough Chronicle reported that the growing township had, by the intuitive will of the people, been named Nashville, and its principal street had received the appropriate name of Mary Street after the nearby Mary River. Of course, the river had been named 20 years earlier by Governor Sir Charles Fitzroy to honour his wife, Lady Mary Fitzroy. And now in the main street you will see a statue of Lady Mary Fitzroy. When you meet her, remember that although she died in a carriage accident in 1847, she was a great lady and is memorialised in the Mary River, Mary Street, Lady Mary Terrace, the rich Lady Mary Reef, at least 7 Lady Mary gold mines, and the city of Maryborough. The earliest photos of Mary Street were taken during 1868 by several photographers. Christopher Moore visited in February, and his photo was made into an engraving and published in the Illustrated Sydney News. And I've given you on the handout a copy of that original photo. Notice how blurry the people are. And underneath it, the engraving made by the Illustrated Sydney News, which rather enhances the photograph, I think. It's made to look very romantic and attractive in the engraving. Most of the buildings shown in the photo had a very short life. Thomas Mathewson arrived in mid-1868 and took many photos showing trees and stumps in the street. Then there's this one. Where's it gone? Over in that corner over there. He took that one. It had to have been taken after October, by which time the trees had been removed, footpaths had been built up outside the shops, and awnings had been extended out from the bare fronts of those earlier buildings. When the School of Arts building in Nash Street was opened in 1904, Mathewson himself framed that photo and donated it back to Gympie. It was remarkable how quickly storekeepers, publicans and tradesmen arrived. Butchers were supplying meat from local stations within weeks of the diggers' arrival. Bakers, drapers, tailors, tinsmiths, ironmongers, jewellers, tobacconists, chemists, gunsmiths, carpenters and joiners, who doubled as undertakers, soon followed. The first storekeepers set up their humpies close to Nash Gully in that first section of Lower Mary Street. The steep hillside was right there behind it. All the buildings on that side of Mary Street, even today, sit on a platform excavated from the hillside. And you can see that if you ever get permission to go in behind any of those buildings, you'll see a wall. The first baker, George Kitt, dug his oven into the hillside and operated just near the Five Ways. The pioneer general storekeeper was James Graham of Maryborough, followed by other established businessmen such as the Brisbane auctioneer Ernest Hardwigg Booth, who set up a temporary post office in his calico tent, using a tree stump as a sorting table for the mail. Three Landy brothers from Dalby had a store in this section, and they also had an unsuccessful gold mine called the Dalby. Most of these businessmen took out a miner's right and dabbled in mining. On the other side of Mary Street, shops were built precariously out over the gully, giving them basements, which you can still see today from Young and Reef Streets. Have you ever had to go in behind the post office now? And you go in and you go down, and there's a parking area underneath it. Well, that's part of the gully. Then there were the publicans. Numerous unlicensed shanties flourished in the early months of the goldfield, and you can see them in that very early photograph. They were just buildings with the awning out and the men lined up in the street. Early in January 1868, an observer counted 24 pubs, ranging from the substantially built but short-lived Prince of Wales and Maryborough hotels to what were called tottering hovels. The pubs' names reflected the fact that men had come to Gympie from all over the world. Bendigo, Devonshire, Hotel de France, Melbourne, New York, Northumberland, Toowoomba. Surviving hotel sites are unchanging markers in Mary Street, And the Golden Age Hotel would be Gympie's oldest continuous Mary Street pub. It used to be called the Queen's for a while, and then they reverted to the original name. Banks are other markers, but their sites have changed. The first bank, the Commercial, shared primitive premises with stores in Mary Street, but it was unpopular because of its high charges and soon withdrew. The Australian Joint Stock Bank and the Bank of New South Wales built premises side by side in Upper Mary Street. The Bank of New South Wales was constructed by Richard Hine, the founder of Hine & Sons, who worked in Gympie as a carpenter, then a publican, until 1873, when he moved to the Royal Hotel in Maryborough and later established the well-known sawmilling business. The Hine Bank was replaced in 1890 by a splendid two-storey building designed by the architect Richard Gailey. In 1940, when the bank moved to a more central location on the corner of Mary and Smithfield Streets, Widgeshire Council acquired the building, and it's now the well-maintained offices of the Gympie Regional Council. Mary Street may have been a cramped location, but the first comers could obtain business or hotel licences from the Goldfields Commissioners and put up their stores and pubs wherever they felt like it. These licences were transferable, and some business and hotel sites earned a nice profit for their earliest occupiers when they pulled out of Gympie. The further towards Commissioners Hill the businesses are, the later their owners arrived on the field, and that's how you can tell as you go along, early, later, maybe 1869. Every Australian town had a firm of general merchants and manufacturers who came to dominate trade, and in the case of Gympie, this was Cullinane's. Jeremiah Swanton Cullinane, an Irishman, started a business in Mary Street which lasted through 3 generations and 2 major fires before closing down in 1983 after 114 years of operation. Its distinctive 1926 facade still fronts Mary Street on its original location. During the gold rush, men quarrelled over business boundaries just as they quarrelled over mining claims. And in 1869, the government asked surveyor Clarendon Stewart to make a map of what already existed in Mary Street. He then had to straighten and widen the street, suggest side streets, and survey blocks of land around existing buildings. And this is why, even today, every block of land in Mary Street is a different width from its neighbours. Subdivisions have occurred over time, but the frontages have altered remarkably little in 150 years. And on the table behind you, you will see a copy of Clarendon Stewart's second map, which made him very unpopular. Straightening and widening Mary Street, and they nearly threw him out of town. Most of the buildings had to be moved back or rebuilt. A great flood in March 1870 swept away many primitive structures, but it was 3 years before all owners had moved their buildings back to the required alignments and cleared Shannon, Monkland and Smithfield streets of the structures that had been built across them. In 1872, Corrie's Hotel, which had been built across what became Shannon Street, was rolled on logs 72 metres down the hill to become the nucleus of the Mining Exchange Hotel. The Gympie Times noted that the removal took 2 days and excited a good deal of interest. The appearance of a large building in the middle of the street being somewhat startling at first sight. This hotel, 3 frontages to the main street, burnt down spectacularly in 1946, and its site is now the RSL Club and its car park. In 1869, an architect named Charles Graters Smith arrived in Gympie, and taking advantage of the need for realignments and the devastation caused by the 1870 flood, Smith constructed many new buildings and designed pretentious facades for some of the old ones. We have a marvellous record of the old and new in photographs taken January-February 1872 by Edward Hartshorne Forster, the proprietor of the American and Australian Photographic Company. Forster arrived in Gympie in January and announced in the Gympie Times that he was going to photograph every shop, every house and every mine on the goldfield. He had light, up-to-date equipment, and the editor commended his activities. But the 2 local photographers, Thomas Mathewson and Thomas Bevan, complained loudly about preferred treatment being given to an outsider. Nothing's changed. And the editor was obliged to register their protest and comment favourably on their work also. For 3 weeks, Forster was very busy. He moved up and down Mary Street and the 1 Mile, photographing mines, private houses, pubs and shops, inviting the occupants to line up in front and stand still for the required time. The small prints he produced are wonderfully clear, and people eagerly bought them to send to relatives and friends, show them my family, my shop, my gold mine. The scene then shifted to the Magistrates' Court on Commissioners Hill, where Edward Hartshorne Forster was charged with assaulting John Harrop Hensel, the agent he'd appointed to take orders and collect the money for his photos. A witness described an argument which arose because Hensel wanted to take his fee for the job out of the money he'd collected. Forster objected, and the 2 came to blows. The magistrate fined Forster 5 shillings and dismissed his attempt to file a countercharge against Hensel. This incident ended Forster's stay in Gympie, although 5 years later he returned and for a few years operated a studio in Mary Street opposite the Royal Hotel. None of Forster's buildings remains today, but when Charles Graters Smith left Gympie in 1872, the man whose influence on the built environment of Mary Street and the whole of Gympie has been profound and lasting began to practice as an architect. Hugo de Ritz, a clever Swede, came to Gympie as a miner and stayed on as a builder. His work is worth a book in itself, and one is currently being written by Linda Atkinson. So that should be a very good publication because he really was the maker of Gympie. Floods. In the summer of 1870, the community was shocked by Gympie's first flood. Now, that is standing on Calton Hill, looking down on what is now the Memorial Park, before the flood. The second photo, same scene during the flood, gives you a very good idea of just how devastating the 1870 flood was. You can see the Methodist church on the hill. That's the church that's there now, the little one alongside the big Surface Hill church. It's been moved a couple of times. In the summer of 1870, the community was shocked by Gympie's first big flood. After a week of heavy rain, the day the flood peaked was fine and sunny. Out came the photographers, Thomas Mathewson and Thomas Bevan, with their cumbersome cameras and tripods, seeking vantage points around the settlement from which to record the devastation. You can learn a lot from their photographs, and there are a lot of them. Again, you got rivals, so they were competing. I used to wonder about these photographs, that there were so many of the same scene. Well, there were two photographers. In 1875, Thomas Bevan photographed another damaging flood and its aftermath, and I'm showing you the picture of the aftermath with the buildings where the flood had been falling down. Not as bad as the 1870 flood. The 1880s were relatively dry, but the decade from 1889 to 1899 saw 4 major floods, including the granddaddy of all floods in 1893. There are not many pictures of the 1893 flood. It was extremely difficult to find a vantage point to photograph it. But there's that one which shows Mary Street under flood, and those photos were taken by Paulson, a later photographer. The river rose during many summers for the next 50 years, but it was not until 1955 that another great flood occurred. There's a Mary Street in the 1955 flood, and you can fly over and take photographs now. For 150 years, Mary Street businesses have coped with floods by moving out. That's the 1955 flood again, Mary Street. Moving out and moving back. You would think that the central business district would have been moved away from Mary Street, but somehow this has never happened. There's always discussion, but it's never happened. Fires. Floodwaters rise and fall, leaving buildings muddy and smelly. But fires completely change the streetscape. In Mary Street, past fires are marked by changes in architecture. The biggest fires occurred during the 19th century, before Gympie acquired reticulated water and a fire brigade. During the 20th century, most fires were confined to one building. The old Theatre Royal burnt down in 1935, Cullinan's in 1937, and the Mining Exchange Hotel, which I've already mentioned, in 1946. The most recent loss by fire was Tattersalls Hotel in 1989. You might remember it. Back in 1877, when explosives for the underground mines were stored in shops, a huge explosion and fire in Lower Mary Street near the Five Ways destroyed many shops and killed one young man. After that fire, the government insisted that explosives should be stored away from Mary Street in powder magazines. You're looking there at the Five Ways corner on the far side there, Mary Street. So we're Lower Mary Street, and everything has been blown to bits. In 1881, a fierce fire burnt a row of old wooden shops in Upper Mary Street, from just above Hanlon's to Blackall Lane next to the Gympie Regional Council chambers. The new Gympie City Council immediately ruled that replacement buildings must be made of brick, and you can see the results of that decision in the heritage registered streetscape of today. Hugo Duritz was so busy he couldn't design all these new buildings, so a few other architects and builders were employed. For example, the AJS Bank, which was being built in timber at the time of the fire, was redesigned in brick by the former government architect FDG Stanley. And this accounts for the excellence of this gem of a building. In 1902, it became the Stock Exchange Club, and since 1922, it has been solicitors' offices, currently Nielsen, Stanton and Parkinson, and they are very aware of the historic importance of that building. Further down the street is Peter Goldsworthy's delightful building, the optometrist All About Eyes. It's got a kangaroo and an emu right on top. The round area once had a clock in it, and it has a facade that features textbook decorations and the heads of two men. Hugo Gyritz designed this building for the mining secretaries James Crawford and Ernest Rhodey in 1885. In 1889, James Crawford, who was a respectable alderman, was charged by his brother-in-law, the immensely wealthy William Davies, with forging his signature on mining certificates. Several prominent Gympie men guaranteed Crawford's bail. They lost it. It was a huge amount, it was about £200 bail. He escaped to South Africa before the case went to trial. The building, which had been financed by William Davies, became his property and was leased to mining secretaries Caston and Davidson and then to Simon Jackson after the goldfield had declined. After the goldfield had declined, it was acquired by optometrist Hodson, then Cavosso, then by Peter Goldsworthy, who has restored it beautifully. Now, everyone in Gympie has always been puzzled about the heads that are featured above the door and the window of this building. And it puzzled me for years. I couldn't work it out. Who were these two? And I've given you their pictures. Anybody know who they are?
Would one be Robbie Burns?
How do you know? Do you recognise him?
No, I just read it somewhere.
Ah, right. Well, we have found out. We have found out who they are. It took a long time, and it was only a few years ago that we found an original description in the Queenslander of that building as it was then when it was first built. Yes, Crawford, James Crawford, was Scottish, and in those days you could buy casts of heads, all sorts of heads, and put them on your buildings, and that's what he'd chosen to do. The one on, let me get it right, I've put it in the right order, I think, on that picture. Yes, what gives it away is the cravats. They're wearing cravats, and I thought, is it Simon Jackson? Is it Crawford and Rhodey? Who could it be? Well, yes, it's Sir Walter Scott and Robert Burns, which every honourable Scotsman adored in those days. They were absolutely the best. So Crawford had put them on his building, and nobody knew for a very long time who they were. At the time of the 1881 fire, Gyritz was building a two-storey shop for Patterson Brothers. On its upper side stands what is probably the oldest brick building in Gympie, a store. Things are a bit funny here, Beth.
Okay, not the right picture.
That'll be my fault.
That one? No?
No? Can you go back? Well, it must be missing. Anyway, you know about Patterson's building. Keep going and we'll see if it picks up later. No? I'll have to just tell you about it. The oldest brick building in Gympie is a store that was built for the draper Alfred Hardcastle in 1869. And it's just amazing where every now and again you find a building in Gympie that really does go back to that very early time. He built it with bricks from the Dudley Brickworks in Station Road. He lasted in business until 1872, and the store was then added to Patterson Brothers business. So if you know Hanlon's building, it's 2 stories, and next to it, and you can go through there into Reef Street. Well, that brick building on the right-hand side has been there since 1869. If I had the photos on it, I could show you that original photo of the Hardcastle building. Some of the other post-1881 buildings in Upper Mary Street are not as well preserved as those I've mentioned. In some ways, the most interesting view of them is from Reef Street, where you get an impression of their tall, dark, narrow brick walls. They're very plainly constructed and they have underground basements. You only see 2 stories from Mary Street, but if you go round, there are 3 stories in Reef Street. Now, the Empire Hotel, there we go. If you're trying to restore a building, that restoration of the awning and pillars, the verandas on the Empire Hotel, is a really good illustration. The streetscape in Upper Mary Street has suffered from the post-war drive to remove ornamentation and the replacement of verandas with cantilevered awnings. The decaying old awnings with their post and hitching rails became a nuisance in the era of cars and, my husband tells me, cream trucks, which needed to park close to the curb, and the road is narrow enough as it is. The Empire Hotel solved that problem. That's Patterson's building, and next to it, Hardcastle's building. So the order's wrong. And that was the original 1869 building, one of the first brick buildings built in Gympie, and there it is, it's still there. In 1891, a huge fire on the opposite side of Upper Mary Street destroyed the section from the old Gympie Times building to the Mining Exchange Hotel. This included a number of old wooden shops and a new 2-storey brick store built for Ferguson Brothers. They never recovered from their loss. They were quite prosperous, and the fire just, brand new building, did for them. Here are some that's a pre-Forster photo of the Queensland Saddlery Depot, which was owned by Woolga. And then, after the fire, Duritz built the Royal Bank on that site. It became the National Bank, and it's still there today. Further up the street, 1-storey brick shops were built, housing a number of businesses, including Hood the tailor and Holloway the plumber. And those buildings, minus the decoration, are still there. In 1929, a fire burnt central Mary Street from Cullinane's to the Memorial Gates. 1-storey shops were destroyed along with the Varieties Theatre, and most of the buildings that have been replaced it there are just 1-storey buildings. Finally, here are some other views of Mary Street and examples of outstanding buildings. Oh, that's a fire. The order of my pictures has gone funny. I like that photograph. That's a Keith Waser photograph of a fairly recent flood, looking at the backs of Mary Street buildings, and they're reflected in the water. He was a wonderful photographer, Keith Waser. So here we go. On the side of the Memorial Park and fronting Mary Street was the Union Sawmill. It was there from 1870 to 1917. Must have been very noisy. That was its frontage to Mary Street at their office, and today they donated that land to make Memorial Lane after the sawmill went out to the 1 mile. It's hard to believe, but the Salvation Army Hall was in the middle of Mary Street, round, what do they call it now? It was Crazy Clark's. It's called something else now. What's it called? Okay. Well, the Salvation Army Hall was built there, and it remained there for a long time. I always think all the other churches, when they came to Gympie, built up on the ridges. So the Methodist Church there, the Congregationalist Church there, the Church of England there, St Patrick's there. But the Salvation Army people were down to earth and with the people in the main street. That's an interesting photograph showing what the street, people complain about the street, but that's what it was like for a very long time, just a gravel road, very wet, full of potholes, complaints, complaints, complaints. When you wander along Mary Street, lift your eyes to above the awnings where the tops of the buildings or their upper stories give away some of their history. And there you can see the old awnings that had to be pulled down after the war. One, because they were falling to bits anyway, and two, because cream truck. And the cream trucks had canvas blinds that came down and got tangled in the posts. So there was a lot of pressure on the council to change, and they required everybody to pull down their awnings and put up cantilevered awnings. But you can see the upper part. That is the Imperial Hotel. What's it called now? Charlie's? And the Catholic Church on top of the hill. You can always pick where you are from that. That's looking at the cross of Monkland Street. And again, it's in the days, you can see how narrow it was. Nobody wanted a wide main street in those days. Thought that would be of interest because that's Smithfield Street being constructed, and you'll notice that's the gully being filled in. And when they've just gone to a lot of trouble lately to do it up, that's what it was like originally. This is Cullinan's here. Looking towards the town hall with the clock tower. Over on that side is Tattersalls Hotel Mark I, no, Mark II. There was Mark III that burnt down. And what you can see there is the bridge. That's the Five Ways roundabout now, but for many, many years it was just a bridge. Jack Pearce told me that when he was a boy at school and the boys wanted to absent themselves from school, under that bridge was where they went to smoke. And here we are at the Five Ways looking down, probably looking down from the top tower of the town hall. And you can see here's this building's long gone. That was Daniel the Draper, an earlier version of Tattersalls Hotel. Walker's Buildings. This is a beautiful two-storey brick building built in 1880 by T.B. Tronson, who was a local storekeeper. He got into trouble because he had a divorce. That was looked upon badly in those days, and he had to leave town. It was then bought by Walkers, the Walker family, your Walker family, and since then it was always known as Walker's Buildings. Still there, and you've got to look up to see it. It was, like those others, dug into a platform with the mountain coming down Palatine Hill coming down behind it. Liberty Theatre. Camerons built the Liberty Theatre, which is at the back of that building. Do you know the Liberty Theatre? Have you ever been in there? It's still there. But it was built by a Cameron brother and sister, and has a lovely facade. It's a beautiful building. The bottom modern shops now don't have the fancy bits. There's one still got the lead light windows that tell you what it all used to be like. London House. Again, look above the awnings at the top. This was London House, run by Mrs. Harriet Harris. Mrs. Harriet Harris lived above there on the hill in Nash Street, and she ruled her family with a rod of iron. She dressed the fashionable people of Gympie, and she was a very good and very prosperous storekeeper. I think I got a picture of her for you. Doesn't she look great? There she is. That's now an arcade, but you can see what was going on above it. Now, any questions?